Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the biggest Fire Emblem character tier list. My name is Mekkah, and we're going to be going over some new mystery today, some awakening, some fates. Because we're already done with Shadows of Valentia and 3 houses, and we did Shadow Dragon last time, so we're just finishing off the October batch. These are submitted by my amazing Patreons who support me financially every single month, every single day, so that I can make videos for you, all for free. So thanks a lot to them, and their submissions are one way that I can do to thank them for their patronage. So today we're doing new mystery with Santo and Roche. We have Awakening, a lot of Awakening characters obviously. We have Brady, Cordelia, Cynthia, Rickon, Sully, Syree, Noir, Basilio, and Kiel. For Fate's Conquest, we have Hayataka and Charlotte. Yes, Hayataka was actually on the list, very cool. And then we have Selkie and Hayato for Birthright to look forward to. Something else you might have noticed is I think the best word for this is truncated the tier lists a little bit. I've taken away a lot of the plus and minus tiers. So for example, the A list here, it used to be like A plus and A minus. I've kind of merged them because I realized I can't really tier people that accurately in some of these games, and I feel like it makes the list look more inaccurate if these pluses and minuses are still there. So unless I really know for sure that 2 characters should be like a half tier apart rather than a whole tier apart, I feel more comfortable just sorting them this way. And it also makes the list aesthetically a bit more pleasing in my eye because I don't have to scroll up and down. It's also more convenient for me, and it makes it easier to just have a better overview of the list as a whole. And I think that plus minus separation, that's something that might come back when a single tier gets too clogged with units, like it's happening to the C and E tiers here. These weren't even like separated, by the way. Like we had, I merged like tiers with almost no units in them. But that's something that could come back in revisions if we feel like, you know what, this, like, let's say that Norn is significantly better than Caesar. I'm just naming an unrealistic example. We could split the tier up here in later, but this is just more convenient and I think more aesthetically pleasing for now. So let's get into the units that we actually have to tier. Danny Doyle was the one who submitted Santo. She wanted to submit a Navarre that has only been tiered once in his whole list apparently, and wanted to submit him again, but the version that joins in chapter 6, so that's why we have Santo here. And then Roche was submitted by Traskmaster thing. So thank you both. Santo, I've tried to find redeeming factors as I always do for my tier lists, and I generally come up short. I often say that FE12 units are hard to distinguish from one another because they can often reclass to each other's classes, and thereby they kind of merge each other's utility. But with unpromoted units like Santo, the opposite is a problem, where they can't really use the reclass system to their advantage because they have weapon ranks in one type, in this case swords, and if you were to reclass him to like an archer, for example, he would lose his sword rank as his main advantage. He'd just have bows and E-rank bows at that, so that wouldn't be very great. It's possible to make this work with early units that join early enough, such as Draug, for example, who can become a pirate or a hunter without really caring about losing his lance rank. It also doesn't help that his armor knight class is pretty bad. For Santo, like, sure, he's a Myrmidon, he can reclass to other classes, such as, I don't know, Mercenary, or he can promote into a Horseman, for example, and then still use his sword rank. But there isn't really much outside of that he can do. So if he's not good in his base class, then there's not really much else he can do. Now, being sword locked is usually called bad in a lot of Fire Emblems, mostly the GBA and the Telias games. I don't think it applies as much in the DS games because swords can actually be pretty potent in these games. Shadow Dragon, it's a problem for sure, but in this game there are more diverse enemy groups, and so you fight axe users, you fight dragons, for example, where swords are actually pretty good against. You can use the Worm Slayer, the Armor Slayer. The problem with Santo is just he's never going to be even in your top 5 of best units who can use these effective weapons or just be good at combat in general, because his bases aren't very good. I did some comparisons, and Santo joins after Ogma, for example, who has way better stats all around. And that's just like a random sword user I picked. I'm not even saying he has to compare to Ogma to be viable at all. But then I've compared him to like Castor, for example, who's like at the bottom of D tier right now. I'm not saying, I mean, Castor might not be accurate to the tier, but I don't think anyone is going to like say that he's an amazing unit or anything. And Santo joins at a later level, 2 levels lower, with worse stats all around. Like Castor, just looking at their personal bases, Castor has 1 more strength, 2 more skill, 4 more speed, 1 more luck, and there's nothing Santo can do to counter that except his sword rank. But I wouldn't even say that being locked to swords is that much worse than being locked to bows. Castor is another unit that I wouldn't reclass out of his base class, as long as, unless he's using bows. Now, just for clarification, I'm using all these reclass examples because one of the big advantages for male units in FE12 is that they can reclass to both male set A and set B. That's a restriction that wasn't there. That was there in Shadow Dragon. That's not there in New Mystery as long as you've beaten the game at least once. So Santo has access to both basically the Myrmidon tree that he's from. So Myrmidon, Archer, Cavalier, etc. But you can also go with the side that Draug uses, for example. So like Knight, Hunter, Pirate, Fighter. But none of these really offer him any viable alternatives. So I think I'm justified in saying like Castor should be at least worse than all the D units. The question is he a tier worse than Castor? Should he actually be an E tier with all these units? Now, I would actually say he's better than Rad. I believe his bases are better than Rad's, and they don't join that far apart, not even an entire chapter. Actually, no, it isn't an entire chapter, but it's still not that very far apart, because the chapter that Rad joins after the Guidance chapter is not very long. He has bases... Rad actually has better bases than Santo overall, I'd say. Rad has 2 more speed, 1 less strength. Further from promotion probably, because Santo can get like maybe a level in his joining chapter, but it's not big of a difference. They have the same base level of 5, so kind of far from promotion. But the fact that the difference is so small makes me think that it's fine to put him in E tier. Better than Rad, but not by much. Honestly, I think it's fine to put him next to Rad, but a little bit above. Because there's just not much of a redeeming part to him. He does have Seeing Swords at base, which means he can use the Killing Edge, but that's not worth a whole lot. But when he's joining, and killer weapons aren't even that great in FE12. They are not, like, the Killing Edge is great in, for example, the GBA games where it has more might than a Steel Sword, less weight, and then significantly more crit. But in FE12, I think killer weapons just aren't very good. There was something about them that made him like even worse than I usually thought. That was what it was. It has 20 crit compared to the 30 crit that it has in, for example, the GBA games and Telias games. So that's another thing that just makes me not like this whole Myrmidon gimmick a whole lot. This Myrmidon gig, this Myrmidon specialty. But yeah, that's where I put Santo. Roche, he has problems as well, but they are different problems. I would like to use Roche to expand on a larger point about comparing units and in difficulty. So Roche joins in chapter, I want to say it's 19, the chapter before you fight Harden. It's basically known as the Wolfguard chapter. You have to visit the village to get Roche, and the idea is that you carry Roche over to Violent to recruit Violent, and then Violent recruits Sedgar, and then Sedgar recruits Wolf, and you have to roll Wolfguard under control in FE12. It makes the chapter really interesting, but it also makes it really difficult, and that's probably why a lot of people haven't even used Roche all that much, because trying to use him for what it's meant to do, is recruiting the whole Wolfguard, actually makes the chapter harder, and I wouldn't blame anyone for just trying to skip the map with a warp skip, or just killing the Wolfguard will probably make your life easier. I don't count this against Roche, because I think we should measure these units as if everyone is being recruited, regardless of how good or bad they are, now if you're intending to use them or not. Like the challenge of the playthrough is basically recruiting everyone and keeping everyone alive, kind of like the FE12 rank, the FE5 rank requirements. That's the context in which I rate units. Everyone is being recruited and kept alive, but it's obviously part of the FE12 experience, so when I have mentioned it. But even if you adhere by these restrictions, Roche will not be a good unit for anyone playing the game, because he will always be worse than the units you've trained up until that point. The only way that he's going to stand out in any way is if you're playing, for example, an Iron Man playthrough. You don't reset the game when someone dies, and so you might not have better alternatives to Roche. But even that, chances of that are not very high, because Roche's bases just are that bad. Let me see exactly how bad his personal bases are. Yeah, they're not that great. It's like, they don't look terrible in a vacuum, but if you actually ever used Roche against an enemy, you would know that he's likely to get doubled or likely to get killed by someone. Depends on the difficulty you're playing on. For example, he only has 14 base speed. It's not going to double anything at that point in the game, even in the lower difficulties, I don't believe. 13 base strength, not very good as a paladin. And it's just his joining chapter speaking. Obviously, you can reclass him. He does have B rank in lances, which is generally okay, but he's just like Santo, he's never going to be up there with your other units when it comes to using lances that are effective against the enemies. Like, yeah, he can use a Forged Rider's Bane. Unless you're trading it around between a lot of different units, you just need a lot of units that can do it in one turn. It's almost never going to be relevant. It's not really like Shadow Dragon, where just being able to use those is enough to have high utility. Usually the enemy stats are also too good to have those forges be able to carry a single unit, even with bad stats, to victory. That's why Jagan, for example, is a lot better in FE11 than, for example, Aaron is in FE12, in my opinion. So Roche just has subpar bases, and sometimes when you are talking about a unit that's not very good in the context of a tier list, people will say, well, if you play in lower difficulties, these units don't look as bad. But in its context of a tier list, you're not really comparing a unit to how good they are against the enemy per se. Like, that's part of it, but the real meat is in comparing a unit to all the other units you could possibly field. And no matter the difficulty, that usually ends up the same for that unit. I explored this point very elaborately in, for example, my Lyn analysis, in the double video that I did on Lyn a long time ago. In the first video, I focused mostly on Lyn in Hector hard mode, and some people in the comment section were like, oh, but if you actually compared Lyn to, you know, if you played normal mode, for example, if you played Eluip mode, if you play Hector normal mode, it doesn't look as bad. And I took the same, you know, statistics that I used for Lyn for comparisons and applied them to a different mode. I just, like, so you can compare the same units, but against normal mode enemies, and Lyn doesn't look any better. If anything, she looks worse, because most of her flaws come out even more in those normal modes. So, and I think the same applies to someone like Roche. It's like, sure, you can make the enemies weaker, but that doesn't make the other playable characters worse in comparison to Roche. And it might also sometimes even make them better depending on, you know, what benchmarks they hit, when they promote, what exactly changes about the game. But usually it's not in favor of the worst units. And I think the same goes for Roche. I've never really been clear on what difficulty we're tiering the FE12 units on, I believe. I usually try to say like it's around hard 1 to hard 2. And it seems like a reasonable compromise because of my lack of experience in hard 3 and hard 4, Lunatic and Lunatic for first. But I also think normal mode is not a great place to compare units, because that's where that's where units don't really distinguish themselves as much. A lot of them are the samey. But even in normal mode, I believe Roche would not be any high on a tier list. Like, its availability is low, and then compare him to anyone on your team at any point, and he's just gonna look bad. I would put him like on par with the Wolf Guard, maybe a bit worse. I feel like the Wolf Guard have an easier time contributing because they have a specialty in bows, and so they can attack at range, and then your statistical flaws are a bit lessened, and then you can also use like a forged bow against a wyvern or something. That's very minor, but I think it's an advantage over Roche and his use of effective weapons, because he needs like an expensive forge to do the same thing. Yeah, there you go. Didn't say a whole lot about Roche himself, more than like concept, but I think it's more important because like I think you already know how bad Roche is. So there you go. Let's move on to Awakening. Alright, so for Awakening, we have a whole list of characters, because this is probably the most popular game that I haven't finished yet. Or rather, that I haven't finished yet in the tier list. I've also played it recently. So we have Brady, submitted by Gaius. Yes, there's a person named Gaius, and they submit other Awakening characters. You have Torchard's submission of Cordelia, Dylan's submission of Cynthia, Kim, who submitted Rickon, Blue Caterade submitted Sully, Alexis, who submitted Syree, Taskmaster submitted Noir, Carasso submitted Basilio, and he also submitted Kel. So, a whole list. Let's get going. One of the notes that I got in my Patreon comments on Brady was whether he is or is not the worst child unit. Now, child units in general are pretty difficult to rate because they are very variable in so many different ways. You can recruit them at different points in time. They can be different classes with second seals. They can be passed down different skills. Their stats are even different depending on what you do with them. So your personal experience with a child matches someone else's experience with a child almost never. And that's like already a thing with units that aren't even that different between players. For example, Crom, just a unit that's almost the same for almost everyone who plays the game because he's not as variable as a child. Even on him, people are somewhat divided how good or bad he is, probably depending on how kind the RNG was to him when he got his level ups. And maybe also like their playstyle and what difficulty they were playing on. So for a child unit, that experience is going to vary even more wildly. Now for Brady, he was definitely the worst child in my last Awakening playthrough on my Let's Play, because, but I can definitely point to a couple of causes of that could have been way different. So for one, he was the child that had the least submissions on my Patreon on who to pair Maribel with. Maribel is his mom. So I didn't put as much care into pairing him as I did to others. Brady was also one of the last to be paired. I prioritized other moms first, so he probably got some of the less desirable dads as a result. I ended up pairing it with Virion, and he also ended up filling a niche in my team that I hadn't filled yet because I was like trying to vary my classes a little bit Awakening to keep the spice in there. I didn't want like 10 Wyvern Riders on my team. So we ended up having Virion as his dad. He could have gone Wyvern Rider because Virion does pass that class down, but I ended up going with Archer Sniper because I just thought it'd be entertaining to have a sniper on my team. I didn't really have anyone with a high bow rank at a high level. I had trained Virion enough to be like a parent, sort of, I guess, but I didn't really do anything with him beyond it, and his stats are pretty bad. So I wanted someone who actually mains bows. I don't think I had anyone who was really good at bow using at the time, but there might be someone I'm overlooking right now. But I wanted someone with a high bow rank, and that ended up being Brady. I did play him for a couple maps, but he was also one of the last childs I recruited, period. I think I recruited him when I was in like the last, let's say, 5 story maps in the game, if that's. He did see a couple maps of deployment. I definitely remember deploying him in the Na Paralog, for example, but I very rarely found myself needing him because I was playing on hard mode. Hard mode is very enemy phase based. If I had the choice to fight a group of enemies with either, you know, a sniper like Brady, or, you know, one of my many dark mages, for example, one of my many sorcerers, or someone who's just really good at stats like, I don't know, Fake or Yarn. 2 characters that got really high stats in my playthroughs to the point where I could just demolish everything. It was often just a no-brainer to just use them instead of Brady. That's kind of how Awakening is built. You would rather use no-brainers than try to figure out a way that your sniper can contribute. So as a result, he didn't really end up doing very much. And the same goes for anyone who's maining bows in his playthrough. Oh, I guess Donald was really good at using bows, but Donald's stats were also way, way better than everyone else's. And he ended up in F tier anyway. So for me personally, Brady was the worst child. That doesn't mean he's the worst child overall. I kind of looked a little bit into what you can do with him if you actually put care into him. But there's a couple of things that work against him. He starts out as a priest, which is not a great class to be, period. Especially if you are a child, I think you're better off in a class that has better long-term prospects. One of the good things about the child units, they join a bit on the level, so being able to gain more XP fast is nice, and being a healer-only unit doesn't really accomplish that. So you kind of want to use the second seal to reclass him. And his reclass options, I mean, they heavily depend on the parent, obviously. His personal options, I don't believe, are very good. Let me see what he had by default. I don't think it's a whole lot. He's like priest that can go sage or warlock. That's what I can see without inheritance. I know you can get Gale Force on him, for example, if you wanted to, but that would require raising Maribel to at least level 10, using a promotion item on her, or rather, you have to second seal her at some point into a Dark Flyer or a Pegasus Knight and raise her up all the way to level 15 Dark Flyer, and then pass down Gale Force. It's doable, but in a no-grind playthrough, which I'm kind of basing this list on, it's not going to happen. But it was good to see that you could at least get it somehow if you really wanted it on him. I saw you can go Wyvern Rider somewhat reasonably. I could have done it with my parents. I could have done Wyvern Rider. I think that might be his best class overall, just because Wyvern Rider itself is so good. One of the reasons I like it, for example, is you reclass, you instantly get Strength +2, which is just a good skill to have regardless of where you're going. But then the flexibility of being able to fly around and use axes is nice. You don't have to build axe rank, like go from Bronze Axe up there. But if you recruit him early enough, that's probably doable. And Brady's Paralog isn't like Inigo level hard. Inigo's Paralog is really difficult, but I think Brady's is not difficult enough to make that a bad thing per se. I tend to just put the child units in the same tier, like all of them. I don't know about being the worst child overall. I do think he's worse than these units. I'm not sure why Muriel is here. I guess I just thought she's a C tier. But maybe B- is more fitting for her because she can go Dark Mage. I don't know. But I think he belongs with like the other child units at the very least. Like, as I said, the childs are so variable, and the children are so variable that I don't think it makes sense to separate them any more than like within a tier. But that's just my opinion. I think Brady is, if you put care into him, probably a good child. Possibly not the worst, possibly not the best. He seems alright. I just didn't do the best job of making him as good as possible. And when I'm tiering the other children, I might revisit the comparison, because right now I've only tiered 3 of them, and it's really hard to do like a meta comparison of all of them. But I think right now, this is how I would definitely put him as the worst child on the list so far, at the very least. Then there's Cordelia, and Cordelia is a Gen 1 unit, and I saw one comment that kind of reflects what I feel about Cordelia, is that she's a Gen 1 unit that can actually compete a little bit with the Gen 2 units, which I think generally means the children, and maybe some late joiners like Tiki. I think she's in a very solid class at base, just Pegasus Knight, being able to fly around and have that flexibility on where to go, and then being able to go either Dark Flyer, which I guess is mostly useful for Gale Force and Grand playthroughs, but I can also see applications from Magic just being good, or going Falcon Knight and being able to use the Rescue Staff. I found her range with the Rescue Staff pretty bad, and with E rank there's not a whole lot else you can do with it. It's not like you're going to heal a lot of HP on your other units if you use a heal staff at E. But I can see Rescue Staff on a flyer being useful to cross gaps of difficult terrain. But just flying is good. I would use her in roughly the same way you make Sumia good. Like the main thing she would obviously want is a pair up that can give her strength or defense to alleviate those issues, because those are the most important stats that she's lacking in, she's got very good speed and, you know, strength, speed, defense, the most important stats. So someone like Frederick or Empty Square, Terrain Tile, Fort Tile, Walking Fort Tile, whatever you want to call them, those could really help those issues. Obviously you like Frederick, but Frederick is in pretty high demand as a pair-up bot because he's so strong. Like Sumiya really wants that Frederick pair-up, I believe. Pan is also very good with the Frederick pair-up. But if you have the time to give her that and raise her up, you could do that pairing. You wouldn't even necessarily have to recruit her daughter, Severa, with it. That's her daughter. Yeah, that's her daughter. Everyone was like, wait, that's Cynthia? No, that's Sumiya. Never mind. I think Cordelia is also well known for having more strength in the long term than like Cordelia is known for having more than that than Sumiya, which is fair. And also I think a bit more defense, if I'm not wrong. Let me double check that. But obviously she joins a bit later, so that slightly negates the advantage. Yeah, she has 3 more defense at base and 3 more strength, and her growth and strength is 50% higher. And our defense growth is also 50% higher. So that, you know, makes sense. That's fair. I don't know if I would call her better because the loss of viability is a big one. And you could have Sumiya, if you're low manning Awakening, which is what I would recommend for an efficient playthrough, your Sumiya will probably outclass Cordelia to the point where it's not really worth catching her up. But I still think she's up there as one of the better units overall in the gen. I would put her in B+ or A. Honestly, I'd just put her in A. I think she's good enough for that. Definitely got some very good stats going, but you do need to take care of with Pegasus Knights to make sure they don't die to arrows, obviously. But if you know how to move them around, then I think they are sufficient. You could also argue she's better than Anna as well. But I like that Anna is lower maintenance and has more out-of-combat utility, so I think you can argue this order as well. Then we have Cynthia, another child unit, so spoilers to going in C for child. Also joins as a Pegasus Knight, Sumiya's daughter, so if you're low manning and you recruit her late, then maybe there's a chance to get Skill Force. I grinded Sumiya to get Guild Force in my playthrough. I don't think it's viable to get Guild Force on her in a really efficient playthrough, but I might be wrong. There might be a way to do it, but I haven't seen anyone actually go for that in any kind of LTC kind of run. So I don't think it's the most viable route to take, but it might be within the realm of possibilities if you're willing to slow down a little bit. But just, you know, flying is just a really good property to have, as I've said like 4 times already, but it's just really broken in almost every game that we have, besides like genealogy. So that's a good thing to mention. Also really benefits from having strength and defense as a pair-up. Might not want like a Gen 1 unit because she can't support those, other than her parents, obviously, whoever it might be. The similar pairings that work for Cordelia obviously work well for Sumiya as well, and as a result, she could very well end up being the daughter of someone like Frederick or someone like Movable Forest Tile or Movable Pillar Tile. I paired my Sumiya with Frederick, and they were kind of my lifesavers in the early Gen 1 chapters, so as a result, I did have the pairing available very soon. It took me a while to do the paralog though, because it was like one of the trickier ones and I didn't want to do it immediately. I did have the capabilities of beating it because my units were so broken occasionally, but I wanted to wait until I have more units capable of contributing to make it a bit more of a balanced experience. So I did that paralog late-ish, like I would say in the middle to late of all the child paralogs I did. And, you know, I had fun using Sumiya. I also had fun using Cynthia, of course. She was pretty good, but besides, it's like really hard to separate her performance in that playthrough for me from Guild Force, which is one of the reasons why she was so easy to raise and use. And I feel like without Guild Force, she would be significantly worse, and probably not worth a lot more than the other children. I rate Lauren's ability to be a Dark Mage immediately, for example, higher than whatever Cynthia is able to do without Guild Force. Severa, I think, is also a bit more solid without the proper parents, if that makes sense. I think she's more independent of her parents because she has the access to the hero tree, which gives a lot of important skills, which the Pegasus Knight skills I don't think are super great. The flying itself is great. Owain Dark, I'm pretty sure doesn't always have Dark Mage. I just granted him that through the Robin pair-up. If you don't have that, he might be a bit worse. So I'm tempted to put her in the middle of it, roughly. That's why I'd rate her as a child overall, but it's really tough comparing every single possible performance of Cynthia towards the others. Like, again, if you have someone like Crom, there's really only a couple classes that Crom can be, and some of them are flat out better than others, and he's not going to deviate that much between players, but child units are a whole different thing. So I hope you don't mind me not going super in depth on what exactly it is that Cynthia can do. I'm pretty sure her best class tree is the one that she joins in, which is the whole Pegasus Knight, Falcon Knight stuff. Her magic is, I think, a bit better depending on her parents, so you could do some more rescue staff shenanigans or some more magical attacks with her. I mostly stuck to the Horse Slayer, which was a forged Beast Killer, which was pretty fun to use. I think I started using her like the Wallheart chapter, and she was able to do some work despite being on levels. So, kind of cool. Fun child unit to use. Alright, next up we have Rickon, who I would like you to know is not a child. A magical character, joins in around chapter 5 along with Maribel. Probably killed off a lot by first-time players because in order to figure out how to save him and Maribel, you need some knowledge of the game that might not be accessible to you if you're a new player to Fire Emblem. Things like, you know, checking enemy ranges very intently, making sure you move them to the right square along with Maribel, maybe pairing them up and put them in that one square where they're both safe together. Maybe using a rescue staff to pull them out with Lissa, maybe pairing Lissa up with Miriel to make sure you have enough range. All that kind of stuff is obvious to you if you've played Awakening a couple times, you've researched the mechanics, you've played Fire Emblem, like you've played other Fire Emblem games before, and you know how important range checking is. If you haven't done any of that stuff, Rickon's probably going to die for you as a new player. Like, even if you play on normal mode, I can definitely see them dying. And so a lot of people might not have used Rickon. If you have, you might have had a similar experience to me where I'm just not very impressed with his combat prowess. I just didn't feel like he was doing a whole lot. A lot of his first impression rides, I think, on the tome he joins with. I think he joins with an Elwind, which is supposedly effective against Wyverns, but because its wind tomes are so low might, doesn't really do a whole lot. It only really starts impacting anything when you forge it. But then the other thing is you can just put the wind tome on anyone, and you can forge it and give it to Robin or something, you get the same result, but with better stats. So it's not even really a niche that Rickon has. This is one reason I kind of miss weapons magic type being separated a bit more, like they are in, for example, Genealogy, like basically the Tellius and Jugro games. Because their wind rank, for example, can be a distinct way to make mage units look different. Like for me, Rickon is kind of like a Miriel that joins later and doesn't have access to Dark Mage, and instead has access to like Archer or Myrmidon, two classes he just really doesn't want. I believe those are classes, maybe he has like Cavalier, but it doesn't matter, he doesn't want those classes. He just wants to be a mage. I guess the one cool thing about Rickon, if you raise him aggressively, promote him to Sage, he can use the Rescue Staff with more magic than most units could, so that can be a bit of utility that he can leverage, but other than that, I don't really see a use for Rickon. When I made my Awakening character guide, I initially put Rickon along with, I think, Donald and Virion in the bottom tiers that I had, or I should say the bottom categories. And here, I think I'm going to throw him a bone and put him in D, because I do think he's a bit better than Virion. I think he has some of the same niches as Virion when it comes to taking down flyers with effective weaponry. I know it's something someone else can do too, but you know, you really got to throw everything you can at a bottom tier to figure out how good he can be at anything, or how high you can put him. Like, see if they have anything that can distinguish him from other units. So that's one thing he can do. And then the rescue staff thing I mentioned earlier, I think also puts him a little bit above Virion and Donald. I could also see this, like just putting him in the same thing, removing the F tier. I don't really think it makes a big difference either way, but that's how I see it. That's where I put Rickon. He's not a child, by the way. Children are in C tier. Next is Sully, one of the Christmas calves of this game, along with Style. I don't think I've tiered Style yet. No, I haven't. So I feel like Sully is a bit of an average unit in a game where you have a tendency to just focus on the stronger units and leave the weaker one behind. And as a result, if you use her, at least for me, she might be one of the weaker members of your crowd. Actually, she doesn't join in the chapter with Vague. She joins right before that with Virion. She joins in that chapter where everything is on fire, the forest fire. Doesn't really have that much to do in that chapter unless you deliberately give her a lot to do. I don't remember her being actually stand out in that chapter, but you can start raising her there. So I guess you can get like a level there, and she'd be a bit better than like Style, for example. A couple memories about Sully. First of all, I used her quite a bit because I thought she was interesting. Even in my first playthrough, I used her. It was pretty alright. I paired her with Fake in my last playthrough, which kind of helped because Fake's pair bonuses are alright. It's mostly strength-based. I wish that she gave like a bit more speed to her, but it was alright. A bit more defense would have been alright, but you know, it's Fake style. I remember her dying to like a 1 or 2% crit at least once. I remember that her weapon ranks were a bit annoying to raise early on, but then as she got good enough at combat, it became a breeze because she has discipline, where if she doubles, or rather if she just fights at all, she gets double weapon XP. And then when you couple that with being able to fight a lot, because Fake was also pretty good, that worked out pretty well. But she had a trouble keeping up in like the late game because she's not as super duper overpowered as the children units when she's actually been given a bunch of levels. So she ended up falling behind a bit, but she was alright. She can use like forged weaponry in the mid game to use like beast killers to kind of make up for any statistical deficiencies. But she's not someone I would recommend using on like the super highest difficulties like Lunatic or anything. She's not that overpowered. She's just kind of alright. So maybe like a B- kind of character. It's kind of tough to grade her against the kids because they are kids. But I'd say like the bottom of B- is like the lowest I would put her. I would not say she's as like annoying to use as someone like Rickon or Henry. I also don't want to put her in the same part as the child units. I do feel like Muriel's better though, but maybe this just means Muriel needs to go up a bit. I actually don't know how good Muriel is in a playthrough where you don't grind, but I just really value Dark Mage axes, so I'm gonna go ahead and put it like this. I also like Muriel better in like when things are difficult because she can use 2 range, so she doesn't really have to get in the way like Sully does. But maybe I'm overrating Muriel. Maybe I'm overrating both of these. I'm not gonna grade them based on like how they are as a mom, because that's what the kids are for. But yeah, this is how I put them. Then we have Syree, who is like a sword master that joins, I'd say around basically when the mid game starts, like the fall mark is about to hit you full on. I've never been super impressed with Syree, part of it being she has no chance to build supports in the early game, which I think gives you a bigger edge in the mid game to just give you a higher chance to dual guard, higher chance to dual strike, better pair bonuses, everything that comes with it. It's pretty good. Syree, I believe, can only support a couple people, like the Avatar and I think Tiki, and that's about it. So not a lot of options there either, so you might just go supportless if you've built supports in a certain way. Like you don't really, like, you're gonna have some kind of support build with the Robins. Like, no matter which one you're using, you're gonna have a support with someone, if only to recruit Morgan at some point. So you would never really want to wait for Syree unless you just really like Syree, which I don't blame anyone for, but I want to use Syree is not a great reason for putting Syree higher on the tier list. Let me just put it that way. So Syree is likely going supportless until you get Tiki, and even if you get Tiki, yikes, it's still gonna take a bit to build up. And then without pair bonuses, it's kind of hard to justify units using it like this, especially because in the Velmark, enemies get a lot tougher. And so, I mean, I've said before, like, no matter how tough the enemies are, you're comparing her to your other player characters, but your other player characters have advantages over the enemies that she does not, and so she just looks weaker by comparison. So I guess all the like promoted enemies that start popping up in Vulm, I think she's gonna have some trouble. There are some things she can do if you want to. I like that she gives a giant speed bonus on pair up, because Sword Master class is fun like that. I think it gives like a +5 base bonus before considering supports and everything, which is kind of unique and kind of interesting. But on that, there's not a whole lot to it, and if you're already doubling, that's obviously worth it. So there's a certain kind of units that will really appreciate it, but they probably want other things more. And if you've built supports with someone, chances are you can get more than +5 speed anyway. So I don't think Syree is too great. I have seen her see some use in 0% growth, for example, where you don't have like, I mean, Awakening, one of the main perks for units is just having really good growth. So when you take that away, a lot of these units just become really, really bad. Like, basically the only units you can really rely on to do anything are like, I don't know, a really heavily invested Anna or like a Frederick maybe. But most of these units are just straight up trash. That's when Syree really shines in those kind of things. But that's not what I'm rating units based on. Maybe the child tier, because like, I feel like she's definitely worse than these all over here. I don't really want to put her in the child tier. That's kind of where, I mean, if Muriel's gone, we can just leave this as the child tier. But does she really deserve D? I don't know about that. I do think she's better than everything in D. Maybe she belongs in the child tier. She is recruited around the same time, so I can see it. Yeah, I definitely want her to like a tier up from Rickon, that's for sure. Let's go over here for now. I'm okay with that. You could argue she's better than children too, but I'm not going to get into that hornet's nest yet. Noir, another child unit, so straight up C tier probably. There's probably children that maybe deserve to be higher, but I feel like the Awakening characters are just not distinguished enough to rise above the child tier unless there's really something special to them. Morgan, I can definitely see changing that, but these children not really. Noir also, I do like Noir because access to Dark Mage is just super, super good. It's an easy path to victory for almost any unit, so I think she goes like here based on that alone. I would call Lauren better because I do feel like he has slightly better options and a better stat build, especially for Magic. I don't really have any concrete evidence for that. Let me see what the base stats compare to. Okay, honestly, after messing around with like potential pairings and things in OIFI, it actually looks like Noir has the better magic, the better speed base, for example, which I think is the most important trait that they can have in base. So maybe Noir is actually better, the best child right now, potentially. It doesn't really make much of a difference, I think, but Dark Mage is really good. Nosferatu tanking, potential advantage, not something I took into account here, but something that they can have as well. But like Nosferatu plus Vengeance is pretty cool. So yeah, Noir pretty good. I paired Tharja with Rickon, I believe, in my playthrough, and that was, yeah, I mean, it was interesting to do at least, I guess, because I didn't expect it to be very good, considering I didn't think Rickon was very good. But Noir worked out wonderfully because Dark Mage is just that broken, and funny thing with Rickon was I actually made him a Dark Knight and got him the ability to use 11 Sword. He actually managed to contribute even when things were looking overwhelmingly bad for him compared to enemies. Like he managed to kill one of the really strong Dreadlords in the second to last Untitled Chapter. That was pretty funny to see him actually do something. But Noir, like once she promoted, or even like before she promoted, she was just really good, especially with Rally Spectrum available. Nosferatu tanking was not a problem for her at all. If she stays in her base class like Archer, she'd be much worse, because Archers in general are bad for the reasons I went over with Brady. So I do think she had to reclass her to make her good. But since she always has access to the Dark Mage class, thanks to Tharja, I don't see that as a problem for her. You just need a second seal, basically. Then we have Basilio, who is, first of all, really funny. This is a fun character to use, just like Flavia. Pre-promotes in Awakening, not its strongest suit. It's got like Frederick and Anna, obviously. But you also have like Syree, for example, who's not very good. Tiki was kind of like a playthrough, like a pre-promote, is like alright, I guess. Flavia joins very late, along with Basilio. And the kind of natural feeling I have with them is just kind of pairing them up, because they're obviously meant to be paired up together. Like they have like interactions in the story and everything, which is why they often end up together. Now I've already said when I analyzed Flavia, like I think she's the better enemy phaser between the two. Mostly because you can give her something like the Hellswath or a really strong Tomahawk Forge and go to town without it breaking thanks to Arm Strift. And she also has Soul and Patience to be just a good enemy phaser. Like this is what heroes do. Basilio's a warrior, and so he has like a way different class set, or rather a different set of skills. And none of these skills that I mentioned before from the hero, which is unfortunate for him, because Soul would have been really nice and Arm Strift would have been really nice. And actually expending uses on a Hellswath, like come on, you don't need to do that. That said, he has Rally Strength, which is always helpful to have. You might not have someone raised up all the way to, I think you need like level 5 Warrior to get Rally Strength. And that's just a really convenient thing to have at base without any help whatsoever. So even if you never see any combat with Basilio, just use him for rallying and pairing up, that's still pretty decent. It's hard to rate backpack units like that. Based on his own merits, I'd still think he's alright. Like, if you support him the way I support units in Awakening playthrough, with like Rally Skill, Rally Spectrum, whatever you want, then he can still do enemy phase work and just do just fine. He has a really high HP pool and enough defense and rest to survive like a couple enemies at least. So he can do something if you want to, but I think his ideal, doing thing is just pairing with Flavia and helping her out. And he's pretty good at that. Flavia is an alright unit overall, and Rally Strength at base is pretty good too. So I don't want to rate him over the staff units. I'm not sure about Muriel. I do think it's better than Sully, so kind of tempted to just put him here. Could be completely off the mark, of course. But this is what I would do with Basilio if you ask me right now what his best purpose would be. Then we have Kiel, Armor Knight child. C is for child, as usual. Daughter of Sully. My Sully was paired with Vake, and I was specifically requested to give counters to Kiel. And I don't know, I usually don't take specific requests like that, but I thought the idea was funny to have a general and then have her inherit counter, which is just such an obvious bad idea. But there were some funny clips that made it happen off of it. Like one of them being just me purposely setting her up to be hit by a hammer just so she can counter him. And also one time she was fighting one of the Dreadlords and ended up killing him just based on counter versus Pavis, basically. Like she proccing counter and the enemy proccing Pavis all the time, and it kind of cancels each other out. Like she wasn't going to kill, but then she was in the end. I think it was an enemy general too. I was trying to kill enemies with like the equivalent of their own class. Kind of a dumb self-imposed challenge I did that I really enjoyed. Partially thanks to things like that. I don't think you can really be that great as an Armor Knight objectively for a tier list. Like, what even doing? But you can probably make her some other classes. It looks like she has access to... Let me see, what classes does Sully have access to? Because I basically just have access to like Knight, General, and Great Knight. But Sully, for example, gives access to Wyvern Rider. So that's something you can do with Kiel to just get her out of that movement route and get going. Then her stats should be pretty fine. So she should be at least like on par with like Brady, Jerome. Audience that have like Wyvern as their best class. I guess Sephiroth can also go that route. So somewhere around there. I don't think there's anything unique about Kiel that I can really discuss that's really great. It's just, I found using her as a general really fun. But it's not what I would recommend. So I have like experience with Kiel to really rate her on. But I would say she's around here potentially. Maybe better than Cynthia. I think the Wyvern class at base is better than having access to Guild Force. I think she's one of the few units who doesn't have access to Guild Force. Although I think if you do like Sully Gaius, yeah, she can get Pegasus Knight that way. Okay, she can get Pegasus Knight if you do Gaius Sully. So you can still do that if you want to. But I don't think Guild Force is important for this. I'm just mentioning it because a lot of people know Guild Force for Awakening. I think Wyvern Rider would be better unless you're grinding so hard you can get Gale Force. I think that'd be her best path. So yeah, there's Awakening. Still a couple characters left. We still have like, you guys can't see them, but we have Stahl, Kellum, Empty Tile, Lonku, Gaius, Naui, Tharja, Olivia, Inigo, Jerome, the Morgans, and what's his face, Yarn, and Na left. So still quite a lot to go. And I expect another big batch of Awakening characters next time. But for now, let us move on to Fates. Alright, so for Fate's Conquest, we have Hayataka and Charlotte. Hayataka was submitted by Bees. They were like, alright, please do Hayataka. If you can't do Hayataka, please do Soleil. But I found Hayataka on the tier list maker so we can do him. And then Danielle submitted Charlotte. So Hayataka is interesting. It's the only generic that we're taking a look at right now. I expect someone to submit Rallyman in the future who is also on here. You can kind of see what generics are on here, but not the bottom row. Let me move it up a little bit so you guys can see what's up in here. This is everything that's on here for Fate's Conquest. I actually can't really see the right-hand row. It has like Lloyd and Lewin, I think, at the right-hand side. And that's basically about it. I think there's like 1 or 2 other generics on here. But there you go. That's who's on here. Hayataka is a capturable boss in Chapter 9, I do believe. You can capture him with Niles if you weaken him enough and then use the capture command to grab him. And then you have to play a couple maps, I think, in order to get him, or wait a couple days, because persuading him to join you or bribing him to join you takes time. You don't need resources to bribe him, or you just need a couple of persuasions, which you can only do once per cycle, which is basically once per map. So what I've seen some people do is you have Chapter 9, you have Chapter 10, and you think, well, how do you get him by Chapter 10? Because that's, a place where you kind of want him. What you can do is like you persuade him between Chapter 9, after you've done Chapter 9, and then you play the Mosu Paralogue, and it gives you another opportunity to do one, and then you can play, I think, Challenge 1 or Invasion 1, and that gives you another opportunity to persuade him, and then you can have him, because I think it only takes 3 for generic bosses. Or I think it's because he's a boss that takes a little bit longer, but either way, you can get him that way. And then you have him, and he's a spear. I think it's like called a spear fighter, and he promotes to a spear master, but it's basically soldier halberdier, but like Fate's flavor. Hayataka, I'm gonna type his name real quick so I don't. Yeah, there we go. And honestly, looking at him, other than the traits of a generic, he looks a lot like a playable character. His bases look pretty good. Level 10 is pretty high. He's able to promote immediately if you wanted to use a Master Seal on him. And his growths are pretty insane as well. Like, when I think generics, I usually think Shadow Dragon generics or New Mystery generics, where they have, class bases and class growth, which mean they're horrible. Like, absolutely dog shit horrendous. But Hayataka actually, for example, he has 65 strength growth, 60% speed growth, 60% skill growth, 45 defense is pretty good all around. B rank lance is a base as well, which is pretty insane. Then he has seal defense, rally defense, and strong riposte. That's a pretty good set of skills. It might be lunatic only. He might have worse on others. But he does have a couple drawbacks that units that, are real units, like not capturable units, but actual people, Silas, Syree, people up here. They have some perks that Hayataka does not have. They can build supports, whereas Hayataka cannot. They have access to more class sets because of those supports. Or in general, I think they might have more class sets in the first place anyway. Just second seal options. Isn't it called second seal in this game? It doesn't matter. Heart seal. Friendship seal, the whole drill. So there are some things that Hayataka cannot do that these other units can. But I've seen him carry a couple like 0% growth runs or special challenge runs, negative growth runs for a little bit. That make him interesting. The main perk for me that I usually look at when I'm looking at Hayataka is rally defense, which I think in theory is very strong, especially for Lunatic, where enemies hit really hard and you want to get every layer of protection on your units that you can. But I find rally defense, like rallies in general, but especially rally defense, really hard to use beyond the first turn. And even if you do use it on the first turn, you generally have to leave Hayataka at your starting location to rally as many units as you possibly can. You rally, hit with him first, and everyone else moves out. But that means the next turn that Hayataka is stuck behind your main lines, and unless he does some kind of pair of shenanigans to back to the front line, he's going to be left behind. And then turns after that, rally defense will be a weaker option because you just, in order to make use of it the most, you have to not attack with him, which might not be possible because I feel like in Lunatic you're almost always under pressure to attack or para-produce something like that. And it's also pretty likely that you'll probably be using him to rally rather than do something to attack, which means he doesn't get any XP. I wish rallying gave you XP sometimes, but I get why they didn't make it that way because it would be pretty abusable. But if you're rallying someone else, like let's say you're rallying Odin or you're marrying Silas, it probably means that they're the ones you want to do the enemy phase combat with. So that leaves Hayataka without much to do in enemy phase sometimes. Because why would you leave open a unit that hasn't gotten a +4 defense boost if you can instead feed these enemies to someone who has? Like, that's the kind of drawbacks I see with Red Defense that aren't brought up very much. Now, I'm not great at Fate's Conquest. I'm working on it. Working on getting better at it, but that's like the issues that I ran into when trying to use Hayataka. Beyond the absolute stupidity that I did when I first time recruited him, my actual first playthrough, I didn't get him at all because I was playing ahead of my upload schedule, and so people didn't warn me to capture him, and I just killed him. Now my second playthrough, I did get him. That was my Lunatic Iron Man. I got him before chapter 10, but I stupidly just went in without equipping a weapon for him. Like, I gave him a weapon, I just forgot to actually manually equip it. He ended up getting ganged upon by enemies and died like turn 1, I think, which is not a great start to chapter 10. I still made it through on my first Lunatic Iron Man, but it was a pretty horrible experience, but a very limited experience as well. So I've seen Hayataka do some work, but I think there are some drawbacks about him that people haven't brought up very much. The support thing mostly, and the drawbacks of using Rally. I think Zoran has a demonstration of chapter 10 where I forgot if he actually uses Hayataka in that chapter, but I know he said that he doesn't think Rally defense is as good as it often is praised to be either. Now, I don't know a whole lot of people who have used Hayataka beyond the first couple chapters. There are people who've done like generic only runs, which I think are super fascinating, using like all the capturable units in Fates instead of the playable ones. I think that's super interesting, and I wanted to try at some point once I've, really gotten into Lunatic Conquest properly, and I actually feel like I have a solid grip of the game. Until then, I think the support drawbacks seems big enough for me not to want to put Hayataka very high, like an upper C tier maybe. That seems really low for him, I think, because, why would he be? Like, he seems so good at first, but I think the lack of long-term prospects for him, especially the lack of supports, makes him not that great. So I want to put him like around here somewhere. But again, Fate's not my main expertise. This is another list where I merged a lot of tiers. I left a B+ and B- intact, but everything else I just kind of merged, just to make it easier to see everything. But yeah, there you go. That's Hayataka for upper C. If it makes you feel better, if it looks really low, I think Conquest has no to almost no bad units, and you honestly could argue for everyone being C or above if you assume that C is like a passing grade and everyone below that is actually bad. I don't know for sure if Benny actually deserves to be this low. I know he can be a real tank, he can just hold the line somewhere, be a good Iron Rune. Maybe that makes him worthy of C tier as well. But this is just my impression, and then later on there will definitely be a revision of Conquest, because there's a lot of people who know a lot about this game, and a lot more than I do. With that in mind, let's get to Charlotte. Charlotte I know mostly as a Xander backpack, and that makes her a bit tough to rate, but I think it's her most relevant way of using her for most people playing Conquest, especially Lunatic, which I'm trying to base this tier list on. And backpacks are hard to rate because they don't really have to do anything. Like, Charlotte joins at level 10, so immediately promoted to Berserker, which gives some insanely good pair bonuses, mostly to strength and speed. Yeah, so even at C support only, she gets 6 strength and 3 speed, and it only increases from there. All the way up to like 7 strength and 4 speed at A, or 8 strength and 5 speed at S, which is insanely good. Works well for Xander because the speed boost lets him double, and if there's anything Xander wants, it's more doubling. The strength I think is a bit overkill for him, but there's probably some tougher enemies that he fills it to a kill without it. I'm not sure if he can kill generals that way. Might not matter too much because they have Weary Fighter, but it's one place where I can think of it being useful. He can sometimes also one-shot certain enemies if he has enough strength, like magical enemies mostly, which is where Xander's a bit vulnerable, so avoiding a counterattack from those is nice. But you can honestly probably pair her with almost anyone for similar reasons. Any physical unit that wants more strength and speed, which is really just about anyone, and it would come down to the same. It's just that Xander is the most, it's one of the easiest pairings to make. Just out of convenience, like they're joining chapters. They don't line up exactly, but they join close enough together to where you could seriously consider it. So that's pretty good. If we were to use Charlotte as her own, I don't have any experience whatsoever doing that, but from what I've heard and what I've seen, she's kind of like a glass cannon with really high offensive powers. This goes double if you use her with like the Brave Axe, for example, which is something you really don't want to be caught using on the enemy phase, but really good on player phase, because on enemy phase it doesn't double and it makes you more vulnerable. I think it like leaves you like with less defenses, I believe, in this game. It's a pretty cool balancing they did for Brave Focus in this game, I think. Depends res -4. Yeah, you don't want to hold that on any phase, but if you're using a Berserker offensively, they can reach some really high benchmarks. I think they're one of the few classes that can one-round the final boss, for instance, which is just a testament to how powerful it is. But I think it takes a lot more care to use a character like that. So I feel like Charlotte deserves about the same ranking as Arthur if you use him purely as a pair-up maybe. Although I want to give her some credit for being able to provide her pair bonuses without any training. Arthur joins like level something, like level 7 I think? Yeah, so you have to train Arthur like 3 levels in order to promote him, in order to make use of the Berserker bonuses, which is I think what you want the most. Whereas Charlotte joins level 10, so you can use her like right off the bat. That might actually make her better than like parrying. In fact, it's probably enough of a boost to get her like over to the top of C tier. It's really tough rating her higher than this because she just does the pair up thing, and then I guess Berserker utility on her own could be worth something. But it's kind of tough because I've never tried it before, so it's really hard for me to gauge exactly how good she is. That's one more thing that makes it hard for me to rate units in Fates. Is unlike like the GBA units, for example, there is a lot of different paths they can take with classes and skills through like friendship seals and everything, where if you miss out on one of those things that make a unit really good, such as a certain class path, and you haven't tried it with that before, even if you use that unit for the entire game, you could miss out something super significant that would actually make them a ton better, and it could change your entire view of a unit. This goes like double for child units, obviously. So it's like, even if I've played the game once or twice, I'm not guaranteed to be able to have like a good impression of a unit. In this game, first impressions can be really misleading, I think, because you have them before you're able to build them correctly. And if you don't build them correctly, especially on my first blind playthrough, it's almost completely worthless, my experience, because certain things you just kind of have to do with a unit to make them good. But this is my impression so far, and let me know how wrong it is. For Birthright, we have Selkie and Hayato. Selkie was submitted by Blue Caterade, and Hayato was submitted by Modern Mind. Thank you very much, both of you. Birthright, definitely the game I have the least experience with of all, and it sounds like a hyperbole after everything we've done so far. But I've played this game once, and I mostly used Corn and Ryoma once I got Ryoma. Selkie is one of the child units too that makes it even tougher to rate her. I've tried to read up some good pairings, but I couldn't really find any conclusive evidence of what makes her good exactly. I went over the traits that I kind of liked and didn't like about the Foxy classes when I was rating Kaden, but honestly I don't have a whole lot of experience either way with them, and it could not be as impactful as I'm rating them to be. But, you know, C's for child, right? I mean, I actually think the Fates children might deserve to be a bit lower rating than the Awakening one. I think they're less powerful in the context of the game. But they're still variables that make it so hard to tell what exactly they do and what they don't. What I do know about Selkie is she's hella cringy. She is one of the worst hero's voices you could ever ask for, probably. One of the funniest, though, I will admit. I think when that banner dropped the first time, I was like, damn, okay, they're really going all in with this. I like it. Beastbane, kind of a cool skill, but kind of risky because I believe like every enemy that has Beastbane, or every enemy that's effective against also has a chance of having Beastbane. At least it's the case in Conquest. I think there's only one furry chapter in Fate's Birthright, and I don't remember if those enemies have Birthright or have a Beastbane. But yeah, super hard to rate. My guess is that you probably want someone to just give her the most important stats, so strength, speed, skill, and she'd probably be alright. But I really can't tell you how good Selkie is. Considering the success of my Awakening playthrough, I kind of want to do another playthrough of like Birthright, where I actually go with the pairings that Patreon suggests, just so I can try a couple of things out with them and kind of base my experiences on that a little bit more. And that will be a good opportunity to revisit Birthright. As is, I don't have the idea that a lot of people really care about Birthright as like a tier list in general, so I'm gonna leave it as is right now, but you're free to submit characters, of course. It's just I have very limited to no experience with Selkie so far, but C's for child. Hayato, I actually used him a lot, but in Revelation, and there I was like okay with him in the early game, then Royals joined and he just kind of fell off the map. And in Birthright, I don't think I even tried to use him because I already heard that he was kind of eh, and my roster was kind of pretty full at to begin with. I think the part of Birthright that I actually enjoyed the most is the early game, where before you have Ryoma, where you have I actually found it like sort of difficult as a blind player going straight into Lunatic to like go around to maps and actually make sure I was safe. And one part of it that I really enjoyed is dual strikes, like setting up dual strikes on the enemies. I didn't really want to, you know, just bunga through with a paired up Corn and call it a day. I wanted to make it a little bit more difficult for myself and a bit more interesting. So for example, I would use someone like Saizo and Oboro and just put people next to each other as much as possible to like really magnify my enemy face without getting in danger. And for that kind of playstyle, I think Hayato is kind of fun because he has 1-2 range. So you have a lot of different ways to set him up with a dual strike with someone else. Someone stronger than him usually, because I feel like his start is pretty bad. He joins in chapter 9 effectively, like ended chapter 8. And his bases look pretty cringe to me, honestly. Like, I don't know. These stats look like GBA bases. Like, he has 16 HP, 4 magic, 7 speed, 4 defense. Like, let me look at another unit that joins like around the same time, right? Let's look at, I don't know, Setsuna or something. She joins like a chapter earlier. And I'm pretty sure her bases are just like super much better. And she's not even a great unit. Like, yeah, her stats are like way better. She's like 3 more HP. Basically 8 strength compared to his 4 magic. 9 skill compared to his 5 skill, like 10 speed compared to his 7 speed, just all around better, and she's like a freaking archer. I'm not saying that Setsuna is like super amazing or anything, but I'm just amazed at like how bad his bases are. Is it me or are his bases like really bad? Is this a glitch in OEF? Is he actually that bad? Because I can't believe just how low his stats look, even in the context of Fates. Yeah, I don't really get what they were thinking. It looks really bad. So like, I can see part of why he could be fun to use. But it looks like a meme unit, and I'm not sure if this is like the kind of meme unit that's fun to use because they're so bad, like you know, FE6 Wendy or FE6 Nino, where their stats are obviously so bad, but it's fun to train them because they're so bad. But I always felt like in Birthright and other games, it's not as satisfying to grind these kind of units up. Although I think pair-up can kind of help with it, like the pair-up system, like dual strikes, dual guard, whatever. But in Birthright, I always didn't find it as satisfying. So I feel like I have to put Hayato pretty low right now and maybe adjust it a little bit. I don't know if I should leave room for units that are worse than him. I don't see any off the top of my head that look worse than him. Maybe he's an actual F tier, but right now there's no one else in these tiers anyway, so I can't really compare him. So I'll play it safe and put him in E. But he does not seem very good. But you know, let me know if you used him and actually made him good. It's probably possible. But stat-wise, unless I'm missing something, he seems really bad. And that's it for this edition. There's not a whole lot of units submitted this month, but honestly I kind of like it because it gives me more room to talk about all the units individually, especially if I know anything about them. It's kind of hard to do about the Birthright units and the Conquest units, obviously, but it's really fun to talk about the others. So once again, thanks for listening, thanks for supporting me and everything, and I will see you guys around. Peace and goodbye. Wow, nice voice crack, Mekkah. Please. Peace.